The gate at Coldbourne Hall was shut at 23 minutes to 6 in the morning, and the man who shut it did it slowly, the way a man does when he wants you to watch him do it. I was sitting in the second vehicle with a leather case on my knees and a numbered warrant folded inside my coat, and I remember thinking that the gate itself was a lie. It was a beautiful live black iron, gilded at the finials, hung between two stone piers carved with the Harrogate hound. The estate had no right to that hound. Coldbourne was not crown land. It had been bought 11 years before, in the second year of Queen Consort Morwenna's marriage, with money nobody at the Treasury had ever been asked to explain, and the hound had been carved onto the piers a month after the deed was signed. My name is Odilia Wren. At the time I was deputy keeper of the Royal Inventory, which is a grand title for a woman who counts things. I had counted for the household for 19 years. I had counted spoons and I had counted state swords, and I had, once on my knees on a cold floor in the palace, counted the contents of a dead queen's dressing room while her husband stood in the doorway and could not make himself come in. That is why I was in the second vehicle, and the reason the first vehicle went first, the reason any of us were on that road at all in the gray light of an October morning, was standing now at the gate with a folded document in his white-gloved hand, waiting for a steward to stop pretending the lock was stiff. Color Sergeant Dunstan Merrow of the King's Own Foot Guards was 41 years old, and in the 8 years I had known him I had never once seen him hurry. He did not hurry now. He stood a pace back from the iron, greatcoat over his scarlet, the peak of his cap level, and he let the steward fumble. "It's early," the steward said through the bars. "Her Majesty is not receiving." "This is not a visit," Merrow said. "You'll want to come back at a decent hour then, and be announced like Christians." "Open the gate." "I can't be opening gates on a man's say-so." Merrow lifted the document so the steward could see the seal, a disc of red wax the size of a crown coin, cracked with the impression of the bench of Eldermore. "Then open it on the courts," he said. "This is a warrant of entry and search issued yesterday at 4 o'clock by Lord Justice Talloway for the house and grounds and outbuildings of Coldbourne Hall in the matter of 31 items of Crown property removed from the palace without lawful authority. It runs from 6 this morning until sunset today. It does not ask, sir. It informs." The steward's mouth moved. Behind him, up the long gravel curve, lights were coming on in the great house, one window and then two and then a whole floor of them, and I knew, we all knew, what those lights meant. It meant somebody in that house was awake and had been awake for some time, and it meant that our morning was going to be harder than the paper in my coat had promised. Provost Captain Alonzo Reeve came up on Merrow's left. She was the law of it. The household provost served warrants, and the guard detail came for the weight. She had a hand light and a quiet voice and no patience at all. "Sergeant, the time." "5:51, ma'am." "We wait 9 minutes." "Yes, ma'am." And we waited 9 minutes. I want you to understand what that was. Somewhere behind those lighted windows, people were moving. We could hear a door slam. We could hear a motor turn over on the far side of the stable block and then think better of it and stop. And 31 items, the collar of pearls and sapphires that Queen Isolde wore to her own coronation, the mourning ring of gold and jet she never took off, the nightjar brooch, the enameled christening cups, the little rose gold locket with the hair in it, the prayer book cover with the garnets, all of them, every one of them logged in my hand in a ledger I had written when I was 26 years old. 31 items were somewhere on the other side of that gate, and we stood in the road and did nothing. Because 6 o'clock was 6 o'clock, and the warrant said so. I could not bear it. I got out of the vehicle. "Sergeant," I said, "they're moving things." "Yes, ma'am." "Then—" "At 6, he said, "we go in lawfully, and every board of that floor belongs to us until the sun sets. At 5:52 we go in unlawfully, and by Friday a judge gives it all back to her and apologizes." He did not look at me. He was watching the house. They can move it. They can't move it far. Houses are not as clever as the people in them. At 2 minutes to 6, a woman came down the gravel in a green coat with a fur collar, and she did not walk like a woman who had been woken. Her hair was pinned. Her mouth was painted. Queen Consort Morwenna had dressed for us, which told me everything I needed to know about how long she had been expecting this. She stopped at the gate on her side of it, as though the iron were a thing she had chosen to keep between us, and she looked out at 11 guardsmen and 2 provost officers and a woman with a leather case, and she smiled. "Sergeant Merrow," she said, "you've come a long way to be embarrassed." "Ma'am, do you know what hour it is?" "6, ma'am, in 1 minute. My husband is the King of Eldermore." "He is, ma'am." "And he did not send you?" "No, ma'am," Merrow said, "the court did." That was the first crack. It was very small. Her chin came up perhaps half an inch, and the smile stayed exactly where it was, and I thought, she believed until this second that this was the king's doing, and that meant she believed she could go around it by going to him. And now she has been told it is not, and the thing she has spent 11 years learning to manage, one tired, grieving, courteous man, is not the thing standing in her road. Captain Reeves stepped up and read the warrant aloud in the flat, unlovely voice they teach them, and while she read, the church clock in the village a mile off began to strike, and on the 6th stroke Merrow put 2 gloved fingers through the ironwork, took hold of the bolt, and drew it back himself. The steward did not stop him. There is a moment in any house when the servants decide which way it is going to go, and I watched it happen in that man's face. We went up the drive on foot. Coldbourne Hall in the grey was a long, low, golden stone house with 3 gables and a clock tower over the stable arch, and behind it a dairy, an orangery with half its glass gone milky, a chapel with a fallen yew across its path, and a walled kitchen garden going quietly back to grass. 51 rooms. 9 outbuildings, 400 acres, 11 guardsmen, 2 provost officers, a locksmith, a photographer, and me. And 11 hours of daylight. I should tell you how we came to be there, and I will tell it the way it came to me in pieces, while the search went on around me, because that is the only honest way to tell it. Nobody at Coldbourne that day had the whole story. We each had a corner of it, and we pulled. My corner began 11 weeks earlier. On the morning they opened the Isolde rooms to the public. The palace does this. 4 weeks each autumn, 3 rooms of the east front are opened, and the people come through in a slow shuffling line and look at the gowns and the letters and the jewels of the queen who died when the crown prince was 19, and the youngest of them was still in a nursery. It is a kindness and it is also a business, and both things can be true. Queen Isolde had been dead 9 years. The line still went out of the gate and down the length of the railings, and half the people in it had brought flowers, and there was nowhere to put flowers, so the flowers went along the railings until the railings looked like a hedge. I was on the door of the 3rd room at 8 in the morning, before opening, doing what I do, walking the cases with my ledger, checking each item against its number, because that is the job, and the job does not care that it is boring. Merrow was on the door too. He had asked for that duty every year since the funeral. I never asked him why, and he never told me, and I found out later, and when I found out I was ashamed of never having asked. Case 9 held the coronation collar, pearls in 3 strands, a sapphire drop at the throat, a clasp of white gold. I logged it. I moved on. Merrow said, "Ma'am, I have thought about that word a great deal since." He said it exactly as he said it 800 other times that year, nothing in it. And I turned around with my pencil in my hand and I said, "Sergeant," and he said, "The clasp is wrong." "The clasp? It's a box clasp. It ought to be a fishtail." I looked. It was a box clasp. It was a perfectly good box clasp, white gold, well made. "Sergeant," I said, "with respect, it's a clasp." "In the 3rd year," he said. She caught the collar on a coat button coming out of the cathedral and the fishtail sprang. She wouldn't have it thrown away. She sent it to Ambrose Quill and he put a new fishtail on it, and he showed her the old one in his palm and she laughed, and she said she'd have him mend everything she owned until there was nothing left of it that was hers. He was still looking straight ahead at the wall, the way they do. I carried the box to Quill's and I carried it back. It's a fishtail, ma'am. It's been a fishtail for 11 years. The room was very quiet. Somewhere below us the doors were being unbolted, and you could hear the sound the crowd makes when a rope drops. I took the collar out of the case with my own hands. I weighed it on the little brass balance I carry in my case, because I am a woman who counts things, and I had counted this thing before. The ledger said 406 grams. The balance said 361. I want to be precise about what happened to me then, because a lot has been written about that morning since and most of it is nonsense. I did not gasp. I did not go pale. I sat down on the little gilt chair the attendants use, and I put the collar in my lap, and I looked at it and I thought, in the flat dull way you think when the floor has gone, pearls of that size, cultured, well-matched glass cord, sapphire glass, setting, silver gilt, good work, French, perhaps 8 years old. And the clasp is a box clasp because whoever had it copied from a photograph, and photographs do not show you the clasp. It was a copy. It was a good copy. It had been sitting in case 9 of the Isolde rooms, and 40,000 people a year had filed past it and wept. Merrow said, "How long, ma'am?" "I don't know," I said. "I don't. The last full physical audit of the memorial collection was 6 years ago." "Who did it?" "I did." "Then 6 years," he said. And I said the thing I am least proud of in the whole of this business. I said, "Sergeant, we should be careful. The pieces were lent. There's a loan book. Things go out for cleaning and for exhibition and they come back and sometimes the paperwork." "Then let's read the loan book," he said. We read the loan book. That is the second thing you need to know about Color Sergeant Merrow. After the fact that he does not hurry, he reads. He read that loan book the way an artillery officer reads a map, and it took him 90 minutes, and at the end of it he had 4 pages of my paper covered in his square, patient hand, and he put them in front of me and said, "Ma'am, look at the dates." 22 of the 31 items had gone out of the palace on loan in the past 6 years. Every one of them had gone out on the authority of the Queen Consort's household. 14 had gone for conservation. 6 had gone for photographic record. 2 had gone for the private study of Her Majesty. Not one had come back. And every single loan docket, all 22, was countersigned as received by the Crown's jeweler and conservator, in a fine sloping hand, over the printed words A. Quill, goldsmith to the household asterisk. I knew that hand. I had known that hand for 20 years. "Sergeant," I said, "Ambrose Quill has been dead for 5 years." Merrow turned the pages over, laid them square, and set his glove flat on top of them. "Then a dead man," he said, "has been signing for a queen's jewels for 5 years, and nobody in this palace thought to write and ask after his health. It took us 9 weeks to get from that sentence to that gate, and I will not pretend the 9 weeks were a triumph of anything. They were a slow, grinding, humiliating education in how a great house protects itself. I took the loan book to the Lord Chamberlain's office and I was thanked. I was thanked warmly. I was told that the matter would be looked into with the seriousness it deserved, and I was asked, courteously, kindly, with a hand on my arm, whether I understood how a story like this might be used by people who wished the household ill. 3 days later the loan book was requisitioned to the Chamberlain's office for examination, and did not come back either. Fortunately, I am a woman who counts things, and a woman who counts things photographs the pages before she hands over the book. That is the practical difference between a scandal and a case, and it is worth saying plainly, because a great deal of nonsense is talked about courage. Courage is often just paperwork done in advance by someone who did not trust you. Merrow went a different road. He went and stood, off-duty, out of uniform, in a shop in the Cutler's Quarter where an old woman with steel-rimmed spectacles kept her father's business alive by mending watches. Her father was Ambrose Quill. Her name was Nell Quill, and when Merrow put the photographs of the loan dockets on her counter, she looked at them for a long moment, and then she went and got a box. The box had her father's day ledgers in it. Every commission, every repair in his own hand, back 40 years. And in the last of them, on a page dated 11 years before, there was an entry for the coronation collar of Her Majesty Queen Isolde, new fishtail clasp, gold to replace sprung, 2 pearls restrung, delivered by hand to the palace, received by SGTD. Merrow Foot Guards. Nell Quill turned that page around on the counter and put her finger on his name, and she said, "That's you." "That's me," Merrow said. "And this," she said, tapping the photographed dockets, "is not my father. My father made his queue with a broken tail. He was proud of it, God help him. He did it on his invoices so you'd know the invoice was his." She looked up. "Whoever wrote these has copied a signature off a letter. He's never seen the man's mark. It is a small thing. A broken tail on a letter queue, it sank a queen consort. By the 6th week we had this much. 22 forged dockets, a dead man's signature, 1 confirmed paste copy in the Isolde rooms, and after I had gone through every case in that collection with a loop and a balance and my 19-year-old ledger. Because the Chamberlain's office had my loan book but nobody had thought to take my ledger, 9 asterisk copies, in 9 cases, of the finest pieces Queen Isolde ever owned. 9. In a public memorial to a woman the realm had loved. And what we did not have was a single object. Not one. We had proof that the things had gone. We had no proof of where they had gone, and a court will not tear open a house on a suspicion of a place, however sure you are. Then in the 8th week, Princess Adela came to see me. The king's sister was 62, rode every morning, said what she meant, and was accordingly not much used at court. She came into my little office under the roof and sat on a crate of unsorted plate and said, "Wren, show me." I showed her. She looked at the collar, the real one's photograph and the fake one's weight, for perhaps 4 minutes and did not speak. Then she said, "Isolde gave me a brooch, a nightjar in emeralds because I hunt and she thought it was funny. I lent it to the memorial collection the year after she died because I thought people should see it." She stood up. "Get your coat. I want to look at my brooch." The nightjar brooch in case 14 was a copy. The wings were wrong, the eye was glass. I have seen a good many people angry. Anger in Adela was a quietness that made the room feel colder, and out of that quietness she said, "Whose signature is on the docket for my brooch?" "A Quill, ma'am." "Who has been dead 5 years?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then you and I," she said, "are going to the bench." She was the one who could do it, and that is the whole of why it happened. A deputy keeper and a color sergeant may carry a truth around in a leather case for the rest of their lives and never once find a door it will open. A princess of the blood may walk into the chambers of Lord Justice Talloway and lay a complaint under the Crown Property Act, and the door opens. It still took 13 days. It took Merrow's statement, and Nell Quill's and mine, and 340 photographs, and a night I do not care to remember when the Chamberlain's office tried to have the whole thing referred to a private commission of inquiry, which is a machine for turning a crime into a regrettable misunderstanding over the course of 2 years. And Adela stood in her brother's study and told him, in a voice they heard on the floor below, that if he sent it to a commission, she would resign every office she held and say why. I was not in the room. Merrow was on the door, and he told me afterwards, in about the fewest words a man can use, what the king had said. King Alaric had stood at the window with his back to the room for a long time. And then he had said, "9 of them are copies." "Yes, sir," Adela said. "She wore that collar to my crowning." "Yes." And the king had said, "Do it properly then, not quietly, properly. If it is nothing, I want it to be nothing in the open." And he had left the room, and Merrow said that at the door the king had stopped and stood and put his hand flat on the frame for a moment as though the house had moved under him. The warrant was granted at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. It named the house and grounds and outbuildings of Coldbourne Hall. It ran from 6 in the morning to sunset on Wednesday. 1 day, 1 house, no extension, no second bite. Lord Justice Talloway, handing it down, said one sentence over the top of his spectacles that I have never forgotten. He said, "The Crown does not lend to itself. Bring the lady's property home." At 6 minutes past 6 on Wednesday morning, we came through the front door of Coldbourne Hall, and Queen Consort Morwenna stood in the hall under a chandelier that had not been lit in a month and told us to wipe our feet. There were 16 of us in that hall. She looked at us the way you look at weather. "Captain Reeve," she said, "you may search. I want it understood that I am permitting this." "You aren't, ma'am," Reeve said. "The court is." "I am permitting it," Morwenna repeated, "because I have nothing to hide, and because when this is over I intend every one of you to remember that I stood here and let you do it. Sergeant Merrow, is that not so?" "Ma'am." "You've been in my house before." "No, ma'am." "No," she agreed. "No, you were in her asterisk house. That was a different thing, wasn't it?" She drew off one glove, finger by finger. "Search where you like. There's tea in the morning room when you've finished being ridiculous." And then she went and sat in a chair by the cold fireplace, arranged her coat and stayed there. All day. She did not once try to leave the hall. She sat where every man of us had to walk past her with her hands folded and her chin up, and she watched us carry her house out into the light, and she smiled at each of us as we went by. I have thought since that it was the bravest thing I ever saw a guilty person do, and also the stupidest, because a woman who sits still in a hall for 11 hours is a woman who has decided there is nothing in the house worth running to. Which was, of course, exactly the case, only we didn't know it yet. The search went the way searches go, which is to say slowly and by numbers and with a great deal of dust. Captain Reeve worked it properly. The house divided into 4 quadrants, 2 men to a quadrant, every room sealed as it was cleared, the photographer following, me following the photographer with my ledger and my 31 numbers. Merrow took the ground floor east with Corporal Bryn tallies, and Lance Corporal Ivo Crane took the locksmith and went up. We found things at once, and none of them were ours. We found in a japanned cabinet in the morning room 41 pieces of jewelry, all of them Morwenna's own, all of them properly hers, all of them documented, and the fact that she had left them there, unlocked in the first room we searched, was a message, and it was meant to be read as one. "Look, I keep my jewels in a cabinet like an honest woman." We found a strong room behind the paneling of the library, and the locksmith had it open in 11 minutes, and it was empty. Not empty as a room is empty. Empty as a room is empty when it has been made empty. The shelves had been wiped. There was a smell of vinegar and paraffin. There were 9 rectangles on the felt of the middle shelf where 9 boxes had sat long enough to fade the felt around them, and there was a pin in the corner of the room, a plain steel dressmaker's pin. And when Merrow picked that pin up on the end of his glove and held it to the light, I saw a thread of blue silk on it. And I sat down on the strong-room step and put my head in my hands, because blue watered silk was what the household lined its jewel cases with, and had done since before I was born. 9, Merrow said. 9, I said. So they're real, and they were here as recently as, he crouched, ran his glove along the felt, looked at it, yesterday. There's no dust in the rectangles, ma'am. There's no dust asterisk anywhere in this room. Somebody cleaned a strong room yesterday. Captain Reeve was in the doorway. Somebody told her we were coming. Nobody said anything to that. It hung in the air of that little vinegar-smelling room with the 4 of us breathing it. I said at last. The warrant was granted on Tuesday at 4. And it's Wednesday at 10, said Reeve. 18 hours. Sergeant, what can a household move in 18 hours? Anything it likes, Merrow said, if it has a road. He straightened up. He looked, I remember, at the empty felt for a moment longer, and I could not read his face at all. But it can't move what it hasn't got a place to put, he said. And it can't sell what it hasn't got a buyer for. Ma'am, Captain, with respect, we're searching this house as though we're looking for jewels. We're not. 9 jewel cases, 5 of them the size of a hat box, plus 22 other items. That's not a pocket. That's a load. It goes in a van, or it goes in a boat, or it sits in a hole. And a van leaves ruts. Reeve looked at him. Sergeant, she said, go and find me a rut. He found 4. The stable yard at Coldbourne is cobbled, and cobbles keep nothing. But the track that runs from the stable arch out past the dairy and along the back of the walled garden to the estate road is not cobbled. It is gravel over clay, and it had rained on Monday night, and it had not rained since. Merrow walked that track from the arch to the gate, 900 yards, with his eyes down and his hands behind his back, at the pace of a man walking a parade, and it took him 25 minutes, and when he came back he had a page of his notebook filled. 4 vehicles since the rain, he said. 1 is the estate's own lorry, I've matched the tread in the cart shed. 1 is a light car, that's the steward's. 1 is Lord Cassius's motor. The tires are new and expensive, and it came in fast. There's a scuff on the corner by the dairy where he clipped it. And the 4th, said Reeve. The 4th is a heavy van, twin rear wheels, loaded. It came in empty, and it went out full. How do you know that? Because it came in over the top of Lord Cassius's tread and left under it, Merrow said, and because a loaded van cuts deeper on the way out than on the way in. Inbound, the tread's 4 millimeters. Outbound, it's nearer 9. It's the same van. It came in and it filled up and it left. Reeve said very quietly, when? Ma'am, I can't give you a clock. I can give you this. It drove out over a snail. I looked at him. There's a snail crushed in the outbound rut by the second gate post, Merrow said. Snails move at night, and they've gone by first light. That van went out in the dark, and the last dark we had ended at 10 to 6 this morning. He shut the notebook. So between about 8 last night and 6 this morning, a loaded heavy van left this estate, 14 hours after a judge signed our warrant. There was a silence in the stable yard. The clock over the arch ticked. A pigeon walked along the gutter. Somebody at the bench, said Reeve. Or somebody at the palace, said Merrow. And that, though we did not know it standing in the yard at 10:30 in the morning, was the moment the day turned from a search into something else entirely. Because if a van had gone out, then everything we did inside that house for the next 7 hours was theater, and the real question was no longer where has she hidden it. The real question was who told her, and where is the van now asterisk. Lord Cassius arrived at 11:20, and he arrived badly. I had not seen Morwenna's son in perhaps 2 years. He was 31, handsome in the way that photographs like in rooms do not, and he came up the drive too fast in a low green motor and got out of it while it was still rocking. He had a coat over his pajama collar. He had not shaved, and the first thing he did, before he had greeted his mother, before he had so much as looked at Captain Reeve, was to say to the steward loudly, across the gravel, "Is the dairy locked?" 11 people heard him say it. Merrow was one of them. I watched a very young guardsman named Pell Oakhurst, 19, ears like a jug, 3 months in the household, turn his head at that, and I watched Merrow's glove come up 2 inches and stop him, and Oakhurst put his eyes front again and went on standing at the corner of the yard like a fence post, and nobody in that yard moved towards the dairy at all. I said under my breath, "Sergeant." "Not yet, ma'am," Merrow said without moving his lips. He just told us the dairy is empty," Merrow said. "A frightened man locks the room the thing isn't in. If it were in the dairy, he'd have asked about the weather. I did not believe him. I want to be honest. I stood in that yard and thought, the man is showing off, the man is being clever, and while he is being clever, the Queen's collar is going out of the country in a van. And I said so, more or less, to Captain Reeve, and Captain Reeve, who was not a fool, and who had a warrant that died at sunset, sent 4 men and the locksmith into the dairy anyway. The dairy took 40 minutes. It was a beautiful cold room of white tile and slate shelves with a churn in the corner that had not turned since the war before last. There was nothing in it. There was less than nothing in it. It had been swept. I have never been so glad to be wrong, and I have never enjoyed it less, because it cost us 40 minutes of 11 hours. Cassius came and stood in the dairy doorway while they searched it with his hands in his coat pockets, and he watched, and he smiled at me, and he said, "Miss Wren, still counting the spoons?" "Still counting them, my lord." "You've made rather a career of a hobby." "So has your mother," I said. I should not have said it, I am not sorry. At 12:30, the Queen Consort sent for Color Sergeant Merrow. She did it properly. She sent a footman across the yard with a message on a tray, and the message was folded, and the footman said, "Her Majesty's compliments, Sergeant, and will you attend her in the hall?" He could have refused. There was nothing in the warrant that obliged a serving guardsman to go and stand in front of the subject of a search and be talked at. Captain Reeve told him so in as many words, and he said, "Ma'am, if I don't go, she'll say I was afraid to." And he brushed his cuffs with the edge of his hand and went. I went with him because somebody had to write it down, and because I was not going to be left in the yard. She was still in her chair by the cold fireplace. She had not moved in 6.5 hours. There was a tray beside her with a cup on it that she had not touched, and on the little table at her elbow, a photograph in a silver frame, face down. "Sergeant," she said. "Ma'am." "You may sit." "No, ma'am, thank you." "Of course not," she smiled. "You've been 11 hours on your feet, and you'd stand another 11 to make a point, and you would call it discipline, and it would be vanity. That's the thing about your sort. Nobody has ever told you the difference." "Ma'am." She turned the photograph over. It was a photograph of the funeral. It had been printed in every paper in the realm, and I had seen it 100 times. 8 guardsmen of the household under the west door of the cathedral with the coffin of Queen Isolde on their shoulders, and the second man on the near side, third from the front, taking the weight on the wrong shoulder because the man behind him was shorter, was Dunstan Merrow, aged 32. She held it out to him. "That was you," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Do you know what my husband said to me the night before he married me? He said, 'I will never ask you to be her,' and in 11 years, Sergeant, not one person in that palace has ever obeyed him." She set the photograph down, face up, on the table. "Every room I walk into, she is standing in it. Every gown I am given is compared with hers. Every jewel I am not permitted to wear, because it was hers, is a stone in a wall built to keep me outside of my own house. And you," and here she looked up at him, and for the first time all day there was something in her face I could not put a name to, and I have never been sure since whether it was rage or grief, or whether at that depth there is any difference. "You have spent 9 years standing at a door to make sure the wall never comes down." Merrow said nothing. "I could make this stop," she said, "now today. You will find nothing here, and in a month there will be a report, and in a year there will be a reorganization, and the deputy keeper of the royal inventory will be given a pension and a house, and you will have the commission you have been passed over for 4 times, and none of us will have to go on standing in the ruins of a woman who has been dead for 9 years. The clock in the hall knocked twice. "Ma'am," Merrow said, "I don't want the commission." "Everyone wants the commission." "I want the collar back in case 9, he said. It's the only thing I've wanted since 8 o'clock on the morning of the 17th of August, and you can't give it to me because I don't believe you know where it is." He put his cap back on. "You never handled them, did you, ma'am? You had them fetched, and you had them carried, and you had them put away, and you signed a book, and somebody else went down the ladder. That's why you're sitting in this chair." He saluted her correctly, fully, the salute owed to the Queen Consort of Eldermore by a color sergeant of the King's Own Foot Guards, and turned about and marched out of the hall, and I ran after him. And behind us I heard the cup go over on the tray. By 1 o'clock we had cleared 31 rooms of 51 and found nothing, and the light was starting to go long and slant, and I had begun to make the calculation you make when a thing is failing. The calculation about what you will say afterwards, and to whom, and how you will live with it. And then Ivo Crane came down from the second floor with a box file under his arm, and a look on his face like a man carrying a live wire. The muniment room at Coldbourne is a long attic over the West Range where the estate keeps its papers, leases, rentals, 140 years of dull. Crane and the locksmith had done it as a formality, because a warrant says papers, and so you look at papers. And in a green Japan deed box marked Coldbourne, drainage, between a survey of 1878 and a bill for a culvert, Crane had found a book. It was an ordinary account book. It was quarter-bound in red cloth. It had, gummed to the inside cover, a small printed label reading * Schedule B, and Morwenna had kept it in her own hand, and it was the single most stupid thing that clever woman ever did, and she did it for the reason everybody who steals on a large scale eventually does it, because she needed to know what she had. 31 lines, 31 items, column 1 the piece, column 2 the date it left the palace, column 3 in her small upright writing a word, held * or * placed * or sold *. 27 said held *. 4 said sold *. And beside those 4, the enameled christening cups, the garnet prayer book cover, a pair of coronation eardrops, and a diamond spray Isolde had worn to her son's christening, there were initials and figures, sums in crowns, large sums. I read that book standing up in the middle of the muniment room with dust turning in a bar of light, and my hands shook so badly that Crane took it off me and held it for me and turned the pages while I read, which was kind, and which I have never told anyone until now. Merrow came up the attic stairs. He read it over my shoulder. He did not shake. He said 27 held, so 27 are still ours. "Sergeant, they're in a van." "Where?" he said. "I don't." "Ma'am." He turned the book back to the front, to the flyleaf, and held it out to me flat on his glove. "Look at what she wrote at the top." At the head of the flyleaf, in the same small, upright hand, Morwenna had written a heading for her own accounts, the way you might write * garden or cellar at the top of a household book. She had written, "Ice House." The estate plan on the wall of the steward's office, the modern one, the one the insurers used, the one Captain Reeve had photographed at 6:30 that morning and worked from all day, showed the house, the stable range, the dairy, the orangery, the chapel, the cart shed, the 2 cottages, the walled garden, and the pump house. It did not show an ice house. Ice houses are not shown on modern plans because ice houses have not been used since the world got refrigeration, and a thing that is not used stops being drawn, and a thing that stops being drawn stops existing. That is not a metaphor. That is a fact about maps, and it is why old houses are full of rooms nobody knows about. "There'll be an ice house," Merrow said. "A house this size, this age, with a lake, there'll be an ice house, and it'll be north of the kitchen in the trees dug in, and there'll be a tunnel to it so the ice didn't melt on the way, and it won't be on that plan." "How do you know where it'll be?" said Reeve. "Because that's where they always are," he said, "and because I've been here before." I turned round. "You said you hadn't, Sergeant." "I said I hadn't been in her house," Merrow said. I was here in the summer of the year Queen Isolde died. Coldbourne wasn't the Consort's then. It was on the market, and Her Majesty came to look at it because she had some idea of a house in the fens for the children in the holidays. I was one of two on the escort. She walked the grounds for 3 hours. There was an ice house in the trees north of the kitchen garden, and she went down into it and came up laughing with cobwebs in her hair, and said it would make a very good place to be a smuggler in. He stopped. Nobody in the steward's office said anything at all. "So the lady," Merrow said at last, in exactly the same voice, "is keeping the Queen's jewels in a hole the Queen showed her." Captain Reeve looked at her watch. It was 25 past 2. The sun would be down at 18 minutes past 5. "Sergeant Merrow," she said, "take Tallies, Crane, Oakhurst, the locksmith, and go and find me a hole in the ground." The wood north of the kitchen garden was 4 acres of beech and holly with a green ride running through it, and it had been let go. Bramble to the waist, nettles higher. The ground under the leaf litter was soft and full of holes, and the holes were all the wrong holes. Badger rabbit, a fallen root plate with a pit under it that stopped my heart for 10 seconds. We went in a line, 6 of us, at arm's length, beating with sticks. It was the most undignified hour of my professional life, and I have never been happier in my work. Merrow did not beat. Merrow walked the ride with his head up, looking at the trees, and when I finally lost patience and asked him what on earth he was looking at, he said, "The yews." "Sergeant, ma'am, an ice house has a mound over it, and a mound in a wood grows different trees because the soil's shallow and it's dry. Beech won't have it. You will. Elder will. Look for a hump with the wrong trees on it and a hollow in front of it where the entrance passage has slumped." We found it at 10 minutes past 3. It was 30 yards off the ride, behind a screen of holly that had been asterisk cut, recently cleanly, with a bill hook, and the cut brash dragged aside and stacked in a way that fooled nobody who was looking for it. A low grassy dome the size of a cottage, with a stone arch let into its southern face, and in the arch a door. The door was new. That is what I remember most clearly of that whole day, the shock of that door. It was a steel door in a plain steel frame, grouted into the old stone, painted a flat green, with 2 mortise locks and a hasp and a padlock the size of my fist. It had been fitted with care. It had been fitted by professionals. Somebody had brought a lorry down that green ride, and cement, and a steel door, and put it in the front of a 200-year-old ice house in a wood on a private estate, and had not written it on any plan or told any insurer or entered it in any account. And in the leaf mold in front of that door there were tire tracks, twin rear wheels, deep going out. Crane said, "Sergeant, there's a wire." There was. A thin black cable came out of the top of the frame, went up the mound, and ran off into the trees on little insulator hooks towards the house. A bell, or a light, or an alarm, and it had been done neatly and years ago because the trees had grown around the hooks. Merrow stood in front of that door for perhaps 10 seconds. He took off his cap and put it back on, which was the only nervous thing I ever saw the man do. "Corporal Tallies," he said, "back to the yard. My compliments to Captain Reeve, and the ice house is found. It is locked. It is alarmed, and I need the locksmith, the photographer, Miss Wren's case, 4 more men, and every lamp on this estate. Go." Tallies went, and Merrow put his back against the doorframe and folded his arms, and settled, in the way that only a man who has stood 11 hours on a palace forecourt in July can settle, and he said to nobody, "Nothing comes out of this door, and nothing goes in until the captain says so." I said, "You think they'd try?" "Ma'am," he said, "I think there's a man in this wood." I want to say I laughed. I didn't. Because the holly on the far side of the mound moved, and it moved against the wind, and then it stopped moving, and it did not move again. Merrow did not so much as turn his head towards it. "Guardsman Oakhurst," he said, conversationally, Step out where he can see you and stand at ease and let him have a very good long look at you. Oakhurst, 19, ears like a jug, stepped out into the little clearing in his greatcoat with the household flash on his shoulder and stood at ease under that steel door. And whatever was in the holly on the other side of the mound looked at him for about 4 seconds and then went away through the wood at a pace that snapped 3 sticks. "Right," said Merrow. "Now they know. Now they know what asterisk, Sergeant." "That we found it," he said, "and that we're standing on it, and that the only way this ends is through the palace." He looked at his watch. "It's 20 past 3, ma'am. Sunset's 18 minutes past 5. It'll take them about 40 minutes to get an order out of the Chamberlain's office. Then we'll see who we all are." He was wrong by 3 minutes. At 3 minutes past 4, while the locksmith lay on his side in wet leaves with a light in his teeth and worked the second mortise, and while the photographer photographed the door, and the wire, and the tracks, and the cut holly, and my hands shook so badly I could not hold my own pencil, at 3 minutes past 4 a car came down the green ride as far as it could, and then a man got out of it and walked the rest. And he was wearing a very good overcoat and city shoes, and he was carrying a leather folder. And his shoes were ruined by the time he reached us, and he was extremely angry about it. His name was Mr. Ellery Voigt, and he was the deputy controller of the household, which is to say he was a senior, careful, unremarkable man who had spent 30 years making problems smaller. He came up to Captain Reeve, who had arrived 20 minutes before with the lamps, and he opened his folder and he said, "Captain, this search is suspended." Reeve took the paper. She read it twice. I watched her face go from a professional blank to something that was not blank at all. "On whose authority?" "On the authority of the Lord Chamberlain, acting in the King's household interest, pending a review by a private commission." Voigt was already turning to the men. "Sergeant, stand your people down, please. We'll seal the door and—" "No, sir," said Merrow. Voigt stopped. It is worth pausing on this, because everything I believe about color Sergeant Dunstan Merrow rests on the next 90 seconds, and because I have heard that 90 seconds described in 3 or 4 different ways since, most of them wrong. He did not shout. He did not step forward. He was standing at ease in front of a steel door in a wood with his hands behind his back, and he stayed exactly there, and what he did was ask a question. "Sir," he said, "does that paper vacate the warrant?" "It suspends the search." "That isn't what I asked, sir. A warrant of entry and search is an order of the bench. It is vacated by the bench. Does that paper come from the bench?" Voigt's jaw worked. "It comes from the Lord Chamberlain." "Then, sir, with respect, it is a household instruction and not a lawful order, and I cannot take a household instruction to stop obeying a court." Merrow's voice never went above the level of a man giving the time. "Captain Reeve holds a warrant that runs until sunset. Until sunset, the captain commands here, and I am the captain's man. If the bench sends a paper, I will stand aside in the time it takes to read it. If the king sends a paper, I will stand aside and I will hand him my warrant card at the same moment, because I would not care to serve after. But I will not stand aside for an office." "Sergeant," said Voigt, "you are being very foolish." "Yes, sir," Merrow said. "Probably." And then Captain Alonzo Reeve, who was 38, and who had a mother and a mortgage and 11 more years to serve, and who had, I am quite certain, exactly as much to lose as he did, folded Mr. Voigt's paper in half and in half again, and put it in her tunic pocket. "I'll consider it," she said. "Locksmith, carry on." I do not know what Ellery Voigt did in the next hour, and I have never wanted to. He went back to his car and sat in it, and did whatever such men do. I know that at some point he telephoned the house, because I know what came down that ride at 25 minutes to 5. Lord Cassius came down it at a run, with his mother 40 yards behind him, walking. He came into that little clearing shouting, genuinely shouting, in a voice that cracked about property and privilege and trespass and his lawyers, and he got within about 6 feet of the door before Merrow moved, and Merrow's moving was one step to the left. No hands, no touch, nothing that a photograph could ever have been made to look like anything, and Cassius stopped as though he had walked into glass. "That's my mother's building," he said. "Yes, my lord." "You have no right." "The warrant covers outbuildings, my lord." "It's not an outbuilding, it's a asterisk ruin." "It has a new steel door, my lord," Merrow said, "and an alarm and a fresh track to it, and I have a warrant that says buildings, and a locksmith who is 40 seconds from the second lock. If you would stand back, sir, I will be able to keep saying my lord to you, and I would like to." Morwenna arrived then. She came into the clearing in her green coat with her fur collar and her painted mouth, and she looked at the steel door, and at the lamp standing in the leaf mold, and at the locksmith on his side in the wet, and at the 11 of us, and at me holding my leather case with the ledger in it. And I will tell you exactly what she did, because I was 3 feet from her and I saw it. She looked at the mound, and for 1/2 of 1 second, the Queen Consort of Eldermore looked at that grassy hump in the trees the way a woman looks at a horse that has thrown her. Then she smiled. "Sergeant Merrow," she said, "you've had a long day." "Ma'am." "There is a great deal of the Crown's property in that store," she said, easily, pleasantly, as though we were all at a garden party and she was explaining the roses. "I have never denied it. It is stored there. It is stored there because that memorial exhibition of yours is a fire risk and a theft risk, and because nobody in the palace has cleaned a jewel properly in 9 years. I have preserved my husband's first wife's things at my own expense in a secure store on my own land, and when you open that door you will find them safe and dry and cared for, and then you will all go home and think about what you've become. And do you know, for perhaps 4 seconds, standing in that wood, I believed her. That is how good she was. That is how it works. I had the loan book photographs and the forged dockets and the dead man's signature and schedule be in a bag on my shoulder with the word asterisk sold written 4 times in her own hand. And for 4 seconds, in the lamplight, with her voice being reasonable, I felt the whole thing tilt and I thought, what if it's true? What if we've built a mountain out of an eccentric woman and some sloppy paperwork? What if I have ruined every one of these men? Merrow said, "Then you'll not mind us looking, ma'am." "Not in the least." "Good," he said, "because there's a van gone from here in the night, and the van's what I'd have minded about." The smile did not move, but something behind it did, and I saw it, and so did he. The locksmith said, "Sergeant, that's the second one." And he stood up and stepped back, and took the padlock off the hasp and set it down on the leaves, and put his hand on the door, and looked at Captain Reeve. Reeve looked at her watch. 4:41, she said. "Time and date, photographer, Miss Wren, your ledger. Sergeant Merrow, open it." The door came open with a sound like a held breath let go, and the cold that came out of that mound was the cold of 200 years, and it smelled of stone and straw and faintly of lamp oil. Inside was a barrel-vaulted brick passage 9 feet long, and beyond it a round chamber under the dome, and in the chamber were the lamp's shadows and a great deal of nothing. There was a workbench. There was a workbench with a green baize top, and on the baize there were jeweler's tools laid out as neatly as a surgeon's. Pliers, a burnisher, gravers, a pin vise, a little brass balance almost exactly like mine. There was a tray of wax models. There was a tin of cultured pearls and a paper of glass cabochons in 6 colors, and a half-finished silver-gilt setting in the shape of a bird with 1 wing done, and I picked it up with my glove and I knew it before I had it to the light. It was a nightjar. Somebody had been making a second copy of Princess Adela's brooch. And there was, screwed to the end of the bench, a small brass plate of the kind a tradesman fixes to his tools, and it read, "The Old Forge, SDCARRS Row." "Photograph everything," said Reeve, in a voice with a crack down the middle of it. "Everything." There were also, stacked against the curve of the wall, flattened, tied in bundles, 30 or 40 empty tea chests. There was straw. There were bales of the blue-watered silk, and on a nail by the passage there hung a spike of papers, and I took it down, and the top paper was a carbon of a consignment note. 14 cases. Household glass and china packed, Coldbourne Hall to Messrs. Vantage & Sons, bonded warehousing, Merrow Wharf. I looked at the name. I said stupidly, "Sergeant, it's got your name on it." "It's a wharf, ma'am," Merrow said, reading over my arm. "There's 14 of them on that river." The note was dated the previous evening. It was signed for at 11:04 at night and stamped, and the carriage paid, and at the bottom in a box marked "Onward" someone had written, "For export. Sailing Thursday 06:00. Thursday was tomorrow. And I heard, behind me, Captain Reeve begin to give the order that would have lost us everything. "Sergeant, take 6 men and the—" "No, ma'am," said Merrow. The chamber went very quiet. Even the locksmith stopped. "Sergeant," Reeve said, "there is a van in a bonded warehouse 40 miles from here with 14 cases in it, and it sails at 6 in the morning." "Yes, ma'am." "Then—" "Ma'am," he said, "it's a lie." He set the spike of papers down on the bench, very carefully, beside the half-made bird. "That note went out at 11 last night," he said. 7 hours after the warrant was signed. She had 18 hours, ma'am, and she used them to hire a public haulier and give him a full and proper consignment note and pay the carriage and have him sign it in his own hand, and then she left the carbon hanging on a nail in the room she knew we'd finish up in. He looked round at us. "That is not how a woman hides a thing. That is how a woman tells you where a thing is. If those 14 cases held the coronation collar of Queen Isolde, that paper would be ash." "You're guessing," said Reeve. "I am, ma'am," he said. "So send 2 men to the wharf and put a hold on the cases and let a magistrate open them tomorrow, and if I'm wrong I'll take what's coming. But do not take 9 men out of this wood at 10 to 5 with a warrant that dies at sunset, because that is precisely, exactly, to the minute, what she has spent 18 hours arranging for you to do." Nobody spoke. Then Guardsman Pell Oakhurst, 19, 3 months in the household, standing at the mouth of the passage where nobody had asked him to say a word in his life, said, "Sergeant, the floor's hollow." He had been shifting his feet. That was all. He had been standing in one place too long in wet boots, and he had shifted his weight, and the boards under him had answered him, and being 19 he had listened, and being 19 he had spoken up in front of a captain, and I hope somebody bought that boy a drink every year for the rest of his life. Because the floor of an ice house is not a floor. An ice house is a pit, a great brick-lined egg sunk into the ground, 20 feet deep, with a drain at the bottom, and the ice went down into the pit, and the straw went between, and what we were standing on, all of us in our boots for 11 minutes, was a deck of new pine boards laid on new joists across the throat of that pit at the level of the passage. Queen Isolde had gone * down into it. Merrow had said so at 2:30 in the steward's office. Down. They took up 9 boards. I was made to stand back, and I would not, and Merrow took my elbow and moved me back himself, and I have never forgiven him for the fact that he was right too. Under the boards, on a floor of dry brick, 20 feet down, at the bottom of a domed pit that had been built to hold the winter, packed in straw and standing in 3 neat ranks like a congregation, were the trunks. There were 9 of them, steel black japanned with brass corners, household issue. I knew them the way you know your own handwriting. And when Ivo Crane went down the ladder with a lamp and opened the first one and lifted out a case of blue-watered silk and held it up into the lamplight so that we could all see it from above, I heard the sound 11 grown people make when they have been holding their breath for 9 weeks. "Miss Wren," said Captain Reeve, and her voice was not steady either, "your ledger, please." I read the list. I read it standing at the edge of a pit in a wood with my case on a tea chest, and a lamp over my shoulder and the photographer's flash going off every 40 seconds, and Merrow stood at the bottom of the ladder and took each piece from Crane and named it, and I marked it, and it took us 2 hours and 14 minutes, and it was the best work I have ever done in my life. "Number 1, I said, "the coronation collar, 3 strands, sapphire drop clasp." Merrow held it in his white glove under the lamp and turned it, and I saw the little gold fishtail catch the light. "Fishtail, ma'am," he said, "recovered." "Number 2, the mourning ring, gold and jet initialed inside the shank." "Recovered." "Number 3, the nightjar brooch, emeralds, ruby eye, the property of Her Royal Highness the Princess Adela, on loan to the Memorial Collection." "Recovered." "Number 5, the rose gold locket, plain hinged with a lock of hair." There was a pause. I looked down. Merrow had the locket in his glove, and he had opened it, and he was looking at what was inside it, and he did not say anything for 4 or 5 seconds. "Recovered," he said. "Number 8, the prayer book cover, silver gilt with garnets, 12 stones." "Not here, ma'am." "Number 9, the christening cups enameled, a set of 4 in a fitted case." "Not here." "Number 11, the coronation eardrops, a pair." "Not here." "Number 19, the diamond spray, 7 stones." "Not here." 4 items, exactly 4, and in my bag was a red cloth account book in the Queen Consort's own upright hand, with the word asterisk sold written beside exactly those 4 lines, and the initials of the men who had bought them and what they had paid. 27 of 31 came up that ladder. 27 cases of blue watered silk, dry and cold and perfect, in the trunks in the pit under the boards, in the wood on the estate the woman had bought with money nobody could explain. In the ice house a dead queen had once climbed down into and come up laughing with cobwebs in her hair. And at the bottom of the last trunk, under the straw, there was a flat tin box, and in the tin box was a single sheet of paper in a hand I had seen 10,000 times in 9 years of cataloging her letters, and it was a list. For Rowan when he is king, his father's mother's ring. For Adela the nightjar because she will laugh. For the little one when she is older, the locket, tell her whose hair it is. The rest to the collection, so that people may come and see them, and not pay for the privilege. It was not a will. It had no force in law. Queen Isolde had written it on a Sunday afternoon in her own dressing room with no witness and no solicitor, and put it in a tin, and Morwenna had found it, and had not burned it, and had kept it in the bottom of a trunk at the bottom of a hole with the things it named. I have wondered about that for years. I think, and I am guessing, and I am allowed to guess because I am the only one left who saw where it lay. I think she kept it because a person who steals a thing wants, very badly, to have been given it, and she could not have that. So she kept the paper that proved she never was, at the bottom of the pit under the straw, where she could go and look at it. They brought Morwenna to the edge of the pit at 6:20 in the evening, and it was dark by then, and the lamps were burning, and the whole clearing smelled of hot glass and cold earth. She looked down at 9 open trunks and 27 jewel cases laid out in rows on a ground sheet, with a photographer's flash breaking over them. And she said they were gifts. Merrow had come up the ladder by then. He was standing on the far side of the ground sheet with his cap under his arm and his gloves ruined, and his greatcoat black to the knee with the wet of that pit, and he looked at her across the Queen's jewels, and he said the only cruel thing I ever heard him say, and he said it quite gently. "Ma'am," he said, "a gift doesn't need a dead man's signature." Lord Cassius made his attempt 11 minutes later, and it was the saddest thing I saw at Coldbourne. He had been standing at the edge of the lamplight since they brought his mother down, saying nothing, and he had drifted, the way people drift when they are working themselves up to something, until he was at the corner of the ground sheet nearest the ride. And then he simply bent down, picked up a jewel case, tucked it under his coat, and walked away into the dark. He got 9 steps. Pell Oakhurst went after him, and I want to be very clear about what that boy did, because it was the correct thing and it was not the easy thing. He did not tackle him. He did not touch him at all. He ran round in front of him and stopped, and stood at attention on the green ride in the dark in front of the Queen Consort's son with his hands at his sides, and he said, "My lord, that's evidence. Please put it down." And Cassius stood there in the wet leaves with a queen's earrings under his coat, breathing hard, 31 years old, and after about 6 seconds he put the case into the boy's hands and sat down on the bank at the side of the ride and put his face in his hands. Captain Reeve cautioned him there, sitting on the bank, and he did not resist, and he did not speak. The case held number 11, the coronation eardrops, one of the 4 marked sold asterisk. He had bought them back himself, 8 months before, through the same broker, using his mother's money, because, as came out much later in a courtroom on a long, dull afternoon that made every newspaper in the realm, the buyer had begun to ask awkward questions about provenance, and it had been cheaper to buy them back than to answer him. So, 28 of 31, before the sun was fully down. The king came at 9 o'clock at night. Nobody sent for him. That is the thing I want on the record, because a great deal was said afterwards about the king being brought to Coldbourne to be humiliated, and it is a lie. He came because Princess Adela telephoned him from the steward's office at 7, and said 4 words, I know, because I was standing beside her and I heard her say them. "Alaric, they're all here." And at 9 o'clock, a plain car came up the drive with no escort and no standard, and King Alaric of Eldermore walked round the side of his wife's house in an overcoat with his hat in his hand, and came down the green ride on foot, past the beech trees, into the lamplight. We stood too. Merrow brought the detail up, and they came to attention in the leaf mold with a crash you could hear in the village. The king did not look at them. He was looking at the ground sheet. They had laid it all out for the inventory because that is the procedure. Every recovered item in its case, in its number order in rows, photographed against a ruler. 28 cases of blue watered silk, open, in 3 ranks on a ground sheet in a wood under 6 lamps. He walked along the first rank. He walked along the second. At the third he stopped, and went down on one knee in the wet, an old man with a bad hip going down on one knee in the mud of a fen wood, and not one of us moved to help him, because you could see he would not have thanked you, and he picked up, out of its case, a plain gold ring banded with jet. He held it in his palm for a long time. "She never took this off," he said. Nobody answered him. "I was told it went to be cleaned," the king said. "I was told that 4 years ago." He closed his hand on it. "I said thank you. I remember saying thank you." Then he stood up, with a hand on Merrow's shoulder. He took it without asking, the way a man takes a rail, and he stood in the lamplight looking down at his first wife's jewels, and his second wife stood 20 feet away between 2 provost officers in a green coat with a fur collar, and the wood was so quiet that you could hear the lamps hiss. Morwenna said, "Alaric." The king looked at her. And Queen Consort Morwenna of Eldermore, who had held that court in her hand for 11 years, said, "It was for the family. It was all for the family. You will understand it when you're calm." King Alaric put the mourning ring back into its case, and closed the case, and gave it to me. To me, a deputy keeper with mud to her knees. He put it into my hands and folded my fingers over it and said, "Miss Wren, it is a crown item and you will book it in." And I said, "Yes, sir," and he turned round. "Captain Reeve," he said, "whose case is this?" "The crown, sir, the bench of Eldermore." "Not mine." "No, sir, not yours." "Good," said the king. "Then I will not touch it, and neither will my household, and any man in my service who so much as writes a letter about it will answer to me. Do it in a court. Do it in the open. Let them read every page of it out loud." He put his hat on. I have spent 9 years being managed. I find I would rather be told." And he walked back up the ride to his car, and he did not speak to his wife at all, and that, not the trunks, not the ledger, not the dead man's signature, was the moment it was over. The 14 cases at the wharf were opened at 9:30 the following morning, by a magistrate, in a cold shed, in front of 2 guardsmen who had spent the night on a folding bench under a poster about tetanus. They contained household glass and china. Every case: straw, sawdust, tissue, and 406 pieces of very ordinary estate crockery, the second-best service, the servants' plates, 2 dozen tumblers, a soup tureen with a crack in it. Consigned in a proper consignment note, with the carriage paid to a bonded warehouse, for export sailing at 6. I have the magistrate's schedule of it in a folder to this day, because I asked for a copy and paid for it out of my own money. It is 11 pages of crockery. It is the funniest document I own, and it is also, if you know how to read it, the most frightening, because those 14 cases were packed by 4 people over 8 hours. On the night of the day the warrant was signed, for no purpose on this earth except to take 9 armed men out of a wood at 10 minutes to 5 in the afternoon. If Color Sergeant Merrow had said "yes, ma'am," when Captain Reeve began to give that order, the detail would have gone down the ride at 5 o'clock, and reached the wharf at 6, and stood about in a shed until midnight, and the warrant would have died at 18 minutes past 5, and there would have been no second warrant, because you do not get a second warrant on a house you have already searched and found nothing in. The boards would have come up on Thursday. The trunks would have gone out of the county on Friday, and I would have spent the rest of my working life as the woman who counted a queen's jewels wrong. That is the whole of it. One man in a wet wood with 11 minutes of daylight left saying, "No, ma'am." It's a lie. The rest is public record, and it took 14 months. The Crown brought its case in the bench of Eldermore. It ran for 6 weeks. Nell Quill gave evidence about a broken-tailed queue for 2 hours and 40 minutes, and was, by common consent, the finest witness anybody had heard in that court in 20 years. The defense never laid a glove on her, because she was simply a woman describing her father's handwriting. The old forge on St. Car's Row proved to be a jeweler named Dissel Vane, who had made 9 paste copies to order over 6 years, and had been paid, at first, in cash and later, because Morwenna had grown careless with success, by transfers that led back to an account in her steward's name. He testified for 11 days and cried twice. The Schedule B book went in as Exhibit 4. 27 held 4 sold in her own upright hand, and the initials of the 4 buyers. 2 of the 4 gave the pieces up at once and asked for nothing. The christening cups came back from a collector in the north who wrote a letter to the king, which I am told he still keeps. The diamond spray took a suit in a foreign court and 11 months. It came home in a diplomatic bag on a Tuesday in the following March, and I signed for it, and I wrote in the ledger, in the column where I had once written a weight that was 45 grams short, recovered, 31 of 31. And I sat at my desk under the roof with my pencil in my hand, and I did not do any more work that day. Lord Cassius was convicted of forgery and of handling crown property, and was sentenced to 4 years, of which he served 2.5. He wrote from prison a letter of apology to Guardsman Pell Oakhurst, of all people the boy who had stood in his way on a dark ride, and said please put it down. Oakhurst never showed it to anyone. He kept it in his locker, and when I asked him once, years later, what it said, he went red to his jug ears and said that he was glad I stopped him, ma'am, and that was all I ever got. Morwenna was not tried for theft. The lawyers of 2 courts spent 5 months arguing about whether a consort could steal from a crown of which she was, in law, a part, and the bench, in the end, sidestepped the whole magnificent tangle and convicted her of the thing nobody could argue about, 22 counts of uttering a forged instrument, the signature of a dead man on a crown document. She was fined a sum that took Coldbourne Hall and everything in it. The hound was chiseled off the gateposts by the new owners, who were a school, and she was required, in open court, to sit and listen while the clerk read out the 31 items, one, by name and their weights, from my ledger. It took 40 minutes. She sat and heard every one. She left the realm in the spring and did not come back. King Alaric did not divorce her and would not discuss it, and I have never asked anyone why. There are things a man is entitled to keep. But the consort's household was dissolved by warrant, and her rooms in the palace were emptied, and Crown Prince Rowan, who was very quiet all through the trial and said nothing publicly at any point, took over the memorial collection himself, and asked for a full physical audit of every object in the royal household, all of it, every palace, every store. It took 4 years. I ran it. I had a staff of 9 and a proper budget for the first time in my life. We found other things. Not on that scale. Nothing was ever again on that scale, but we found things, and we got them back. And every item in every case in every royal room in Eldermore now carries a weight and a photograph and a mark, and no object leaves any palace without a signature that is checked against a living hand. There is a printed form for it. It has, at the head of it in small letters, a line of instruction to the clerk that I wrote myself, and that nobody has ever thought to take out. Verify that the person signing is alive. The Isolde rooms reopened in the autumn, 2 years after the raid. They put the real collar back in case 9. They put the nightjar brooch in case 14, because Princess Adela said that she had lent it to the people, and the people should have it, and she was not going to let one thief cost the country a bird. They put the rose gold locket in a case of its own with a small card that said only given to the Queen by her mother, intended by her for her granddaughter, and there was a queue at that case every day for a month. And on the morning it opened, at 8 o'clock, before the doors, I walked the cases with my ledger, because that is the job, and the job does not care how the thing ended. And Colour Sergeant Dunstan Merrow stood at the door of the 3rd room, as he had every autumn since the funeral, at attention, eyes front, saying nothing. They had offered him things by then. A commission twice, a decoration he declined in writing in 11 words. A newspaper offered him money that would have bought a farm, and he sent the letter back with the seal unbroken. What he had asked for, when the Crown asked him what he wanted, and he thought about it for a week before he answered, was 2 things. The first was that Ambrose Quill's name be cleared in open court and printed in the Gazette, because for 5 years a forger had signed a dead goldsmith's name to a crime, and Quill's daughter had a shop on Cutler's Row with his name over the door. The second was that the household should keep the inventory, not reform it, not modernize it, not review it, keep it, pay for it. Let a woman with a balance and a ledger walk the cases at 8 in the morning until the end of time. They gave him both. It cost them almost nothing, which is why they gave him both, and it is the reason none of it can ever quietly happen again. I stopped in front of him that morning in the empty room, with the light coming through the east windows onto the glass of case 9, and I said, "Sergeant." "Ma'am." 9 years she was dead, I said, and 40,000 people a year came and cried at a piece of glass. "Yes, ma'am." "And you knew from a clasp." He did not answer that. He was on duty, and men on duty do not chat, and in 8 years I had never once got a word out of him that was not either an answer or the truth. But he did, and I have never told anyone this, and I am telling it now because I am old and there is nobody left to be embarrassed by it. He did move his eyes once from the wall to the case, to the collar lying on its blue silk with the little gold fishtail catching the morning, and he looked at it for about as long as it takes to say a name. Then he put his eyes front again, and the doors opened downstairs, and the rope dropped, and I heard the sound the crowd makes when they let it in, that low, hushed, shuffling sound of a great many people coming to see a woman they had loved. And Colour Sergeant Merrow stood his post, in the 3rd room, at attention, in front of what he had brought back out of a hole in the ground, and let them come.